Well, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Clark, and I'm director of the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at used to be at Central, at UConn now. I'm so used to saying that. And we support the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force here in Connecticut. The task force is actually started in 2019 as a result of state legislation, but then became more prominent in 2020 after the passage of the Police Accountability Bill, the only act that actually passed the legislature in 2020, and it added additional duties to the role of the task force, and we will be talking about some of those tonight. We're going to be focusing primarily on the recommendations out of two subcommittees of the task force, the Public Awareness Subcommittee, which focused its work on diversity in law enforcement, on recruitment, retention, and promotion of both female and minority officers, as well as those from the disability community, and the Improving Police Interactions with the Disability Community Subcommittee. And we're fortunate to be joined by task force members today. But before we get going, we're going to start with a few presentations on that work, and then we're going to go to a moderated conversation with Stan Simpson. And then we will go to Q&A both from the audience but also from those virtually watching us on Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the task force chair, Daryl McGraw, who would like to say a few words of welcome to everyone.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Daryl McGraw. I'm the chair of the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force. I want to thank our guests for coming long and far. I want to thank everyone that's watching on through Zoom, and feel free to keep our Zoom people busy, like our messaging, keep that chat box going hot, and everyone, enjoy yourselves. And this is a community conversation. We wanted to bring the community. We want to hear from the community. We want to hear from you. So feel free to have some water, some refreshments, food. It's not too late. We're at West Hartford Town Hall. If you see us, come on down. We welcome you, and this is a space for all of us to have this conversation, and I'm excited for tonight. So once again, thank you all for coming, and let's get this thing going.
And thank you. And before we go further, I would also like to let folks know, those that are watching on Zoom and maybe watching on CTN, that we will also have two additional conversations. Tomorrow night we'll be at Farmington Public Library on Monteith Drive. That's also from 6 to 8 p.m. And then Wednesday night we'll be in the main branch of the Hartford Public Library, also from 6 to 8 p.m. You can register on ctpolicetransparency.com, and you'll find more information there as well. So thank you very much. Our first presentation is from Dr. Anee Kringen. Dr. Kringen is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven, where she has served both assistant chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and the assistant dean of the Henry Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences. Her personal research focuses on policing, specifically organizational issues that affect diversification. An evidence-based policy advocate, she seeks to conduct research that bridges the gap between critical perspectives on race and gender and policing through policy change. Dr. Kringen has conducted multiple large-scale evaluations for major metropolitan law enforcement agencies and for the Bureau of Justice Assistance. She has been a discussant at the NIJ and has briefed U.S. Congress about challenges to diversification in law enforcement. Currently, actually it started in 2021, the Austin, Texas Police Department welcomed Dr. Kringen to the department as the new Training Academy Division Manager. In APD, Dr. Kringen will play a significant role in revising the APD Police Cadet Program as part of the reimagining public safety process. And you may have seen her a couple weekends ago on 60 Minutes. They did a segment on reimagining policing, and she was actually on that. So, Dr. Kringen, the floor is yours.
These are not issues facing Connecticut solely, right? So I've worked with a lot of large-scale agencies across the nation that are facing these same dilemmas, right? But one of the things that I really would applaud the recommendations and the work of the task force is that this is sort of about moving us forward, right? What are the tangible things that we can do so that we're not necessarily having the same buzzword discussions, but we're thinking about what are the things that we can do as a state so we can lead in these types of endeavors. So let's move to the next slide. So just thank you again so much for having me. One of the things that I think is really important when discussing this idea of diversity is to really cover what do we mean by diversity, right? And what is the empirical evidence that supports this idea of diversification? So when we first start off with the idea of racial diversity, I give the national stats of where we are in the United States. Connecticut is less diverse, where all agencies so far in the state of Connecticut are looking at more 84% white, 5.8% black, 6.3% Hispanic, and less than 1% Asian. However, larger agencies here in Connecticut do have greater diversity, right? With about 12% black, 16% Hispanic, and still less than 1% Asian. And there's conflicting evidence about the impact of diversification on policing. However, there have been more recent studies in the last 2 years, one out of Chicago, that suggests that black and Hispanic officers make fewer stops and fewer arrests, right? And that there's actually perhaps less use of force. And so one of the things that we want to just think about is what is the potential impact of racial diversity on communities, right? On the communities that we're serving. And there's also this idea of representative bureaucracy, which we often hear from communities, which is, do I have an officer that looks like me, right? There isn't a whole lot of empirical evidence supporting, hey, that there are necessarily outcome changes, right? But in those interactions, are you more comfortable talking to someone who looks like you, and that you can then share those experiences? They're more likely to maybe understand the background of you know, how you were brought up. And so this is really important in that. But I do always think it's an important caveat to say we don't have empirical support for this idea of representative bureaucracy. The next slide discusses the idea of gender diversity, which is sort of my big area of interest, specifically women in policing. There's some support that women are better at communication, which is a large part of interacting with the public, procedural justice, and de-escalation. It was interesting, I was on a phone call earlier on today with some individuals from California who are interested in discussing these ideas with Post, right? And they talked about this idea of, hey, it's a really different, it's about different backgrounds, but more importantly, it's also about understanding that you don't have to go to every interaction knowing that you may get in a fight, that sometimes you might think about different strategies, right? And that anecdotally, a lot of times when I've done interviews with women in policing, they say it's not that we can't handle business, it's that we'd rather not, right? We'd rather go into these interactions knowing, hey, I will use force if necessary, but I may not be able to win this fight. So what are the other tactics that I can utilize, right? And so that may be part of the reason why we found there are some studies that have better, that women are better at de-escalation. And I usually like to think about, for the next slide, one of the reasons why we even think about diversity is the idea that gender diversity and racial diversity have something in common, which is perhaps this idea of ideological diversity, right? Which is that if you have people from different backgrounds, right, that they're able to bring something different to the table, right? And that we know that if there is ideological diversity, right, that we're less likely to engage in things like groupthink, right? And so as departments are thinking about how are we more creative with our solutions, do we bring more people to the table that just offer a different perspective and a different way of doing things? And so that this might support improved community interactions, right? Police legitimacy, procedural justice, all of the things that we really want. And that in the end, if you have those conflicting viewpoints, can you actually arrive to better decision making, which I think is extremely important when you think of this idea of a strict command structure, right? We know within policing that there is a command structure, that it exists for a reason, but if you can have people in the chain who can think about things differently, right, and feel comfortable at least being able to navigate those sort of decisions and to have those discussions while they're at the table, right? That perhaps you wouldn't just have kind of information going down the pipeline to the officer, right? And so I think these are things to think about as we engage in this discussion about diversity. On the next slide, we get into the idea of what do we think about when we think about what types of involvement we would like communities to see, right? And the first recommendation that we put forth is really that in the end, we want to see DEI or this diversity community involvement as part of the accreditation, right? And so right now, CALIA doesn't actually include diversity in its standard, right? However, we want to think about within POST, would we actually have various ways that we would add community engagement as part of that? And that's part of our first recommendation, and one that we're really interested in getting feedback from the communities on. Next slide. The second one is establishing statewide promising practices. I use the term promising practices because, quite frankly, there isn't enough research out there that really allows us to understand what is the best practice in these areas. There are only a few randomized control trials even demonstrating what are the best ways to recruit and hire diverse populations in specifically law enforcement. However, this is extremely important because as this research comes out, it may not always be translated to agencies, which means they might be unaware of what are the things that they should be doing to actually diversify, right? So we've tended to look at the same recommendations from, 30 years ago on how to recruit women in policing, which were things like you have to serve, right? Everyone wants to serve. And that more recent research has demonstrated it's not about service. They want to be challenged, right? And that women are actually more likely to apply to these agencies if they're looking for a challenge message or if there are benefits to the job, right? And so we want to move away from maybe perhaps even stereotyping these populations and thinking about what works, and more importantly, or even what potentially works, and then how do we inform agencies so that they can think about the practices that they're doing and do they actually fit in the model of best practices. So the second recommendation is the dissemination of these practices, and then also this idea of data collection, right? Is that in some way we also have to say, well, what can we measure, right? We don't know if something works if we're not actually capturing the measurements behind this. Next slide. And the third one relates this idea of promising practices and the idea of within POST establishing a diversity, equity, inclusion unit, right? I also know, and I just want to point this out because some of you may be looking at this and saying, why within POST, right? And it's interesting for me coming from a purely research background and then moving into an agency, that I think there are obviously pros and cons of being nested within a law enforcement agency or entity. But I think that for data collection and analyses, you have to be pretty close to home and you have to be pretty close to the evaluation, the accreditation. And it also allows you to understand problems, right? So the agency that I'm working with right now, I sort of get to know within real time what are the problems or what are the issues related to policy that we're struggling with, usually within the hour or within a pretty quick amount of time to make real-time decisions for changes, right? And so that's one of the discussions that we had in saying it should be within POST for these reasons of being able to understand what our agencies are doing, right? And being able to say that there is one, kind of statewide collection agency for these things, and being able to evaluate these plans related to diversity, equity, inclusion, right? So that there isn't arbitrary target marks for number of officers within a racial category, but more importantly, what is their plan and how are they working towards these specific plans? And then the fourth one is one that I think is probably the newest for many police organizations or law enforcement organizations. And one of the reasons why is because we think about what are sworn individuals doing, but then what are the sort of capacities within civilian staff, right? In Austin, this is one of the things that we've been talking about related to are sworn doing everything that they need to be doing, or is there room for civilian staff, right? In Connecticut, I know you were also doing the same. I know certain agencies are working with social workers, and that we're trying to think about what does that partnership really look like, and so that these are really important things to think about. Also, from a data collection standpoint, this is my inner nerd, but I always am a little concerned that we don't actually even know who works within agencies, right? And so on a national level, we collect information on sworn officers, but we don't actually have any information on the civilian personnel, on what are their demographic characteristics, right? What are the types of job functions that they're performing? And so that these are really important to understand, what are the relationships between the civilian individuals who work within police agencies as well as with the sworn. And so this is sort of more of an exploratory recommendation to really be able to, I think, pivot Connecticut further ahead to saying we now understand not just what sworn individuals are doing, but what are agencies overall doing, including the civilian personnel as well. And so what are some of the other recommendations you'd like to include? So this is sort of where I think Stan will be guiding the conversation on here are the things that we've proposed, but also what are the other kind of experiences that people have had with their police agencies? Or I know we do have law enforcement personnel in the room as well. What are the struggles that you've had that perhaps these recommendations either miss the mark, right? Or there are certain ways that we would consider, moving forward with those conversations in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kringen. And just so folks know how the process is occurring here, the task force was asked to provide feedback and recommendations on these particular topics. There's a list of several of them. We're just going to be talking about a few of them tonight, but we will be issuing a final report in the end of December this year. And what we wanted to do is come out to the community, talk to you about some of these recommendations and get your feedback on them, because it's really important that the community understands what the task force has been up to. We've had a series of listening sessions up until this point in the 2 years that we've been working, but we've finally gotten to the recommendation stage, and we'd love to hear from you, because some of these things may be enacted in the next legislative session, which begins in February. So there still is time for feedback. So how this is going to work, we're going to have one more presentation on the work of the Improving Interactions with the Disability Subcommittee, and that will be by Dr. Meghan Peterson, and then we'll go to a little Q&A from the audience about those presentations and a moderated conversation with Stan Simpson. So I'd like to invite Dr. Peterson up to the mic. She's a lifelong resident of Connecticut, who earned her BA with a double major in political science and religious studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. Upon graduation in 2011, Dr. Peterson returned to Connecticut for graduate work at the University of Connecticut. There she earned her MA in political science in 2013 and her PhD in political science in 2017. During her years of doctoral work, Peterson was fortunate to participate in 2 invaluable internship opportunities with the Connecticut State Police, one with the Sex Offender Registry Unit, the other with the Computer Crimes Unit. Subsequently, Meghan worked with colleagues at the IMRP on the state task force charged with reviewing and modifying the Connecticut State Sex Offender Registry in 2017. Dr. Peterson.
Thank you. Good evening. Meghan Peterson, as Andrew said, I'm a research analyst at the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, now at the UConn Hartford campus. The IMRP, for short, has been providing research support for the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force. In specific, the Institute has been providing informational material to the 3 subcommittees that comprise the task force. the improving police interactions with the disability community, logistics, and public awareness. That informational material forms the groundwork for recommendations the subcommittees contemplate, look at, discuss, and ultimately present to the broader task force for further action, and ultimately to the state lawmaking body in Connecticut, the Connecticut General Assembly. The task force was created in 2019 to examine broad topics centered on policing in the state of Connecticut. During a special legislative session in July 2020, a variety of study priorities were added. Among these additions was the assignment of examining interactions between police, law enforcement personnel, and those persons in Connecticut who have intellectual, mental, and/or physical disabilities. So either one, a single disability, or a combination of those. What this focus entails and means is, one, looking further into those emergency calls placed to 911 or to 988, which is a new number that will take effect July 16, 2022, or to 211, your community resource, which is headed by the Connecticut United Way. So it's looking at those calls that are placed by those persons experiencing a crisis, whether related to the disability or not. And then finally, how do police and other emergency responders respond to that call on scene? So in short, a main question of all of this is what happens before, during, and after that call is placed by that person in crisis who has a disability or disabilities. Or it could be that that call was made by a guardian or a friend or a relative on that person's behalf. Often, as is the case with media coverage of encounters between police, law enforcement, and persons with disabilities does not always flesh out the whole story of what occurred or what underlied those characteristics of both the police response on the one hand and the person in crisis on the other. For an example, an individual is experiencing an episode of epilepsy and is having a seizure. How does that police officer respond to that person on scene? How does that individual communicate relevant information to that law enforcement officer, if they are able to in the first place? So how can we improve response on the law enforcement side? And how can we improve, prior to that incident, possibly medical information sharing and trust building on the part of that individual with disabilities? How can we provide for the reduction, ideally the absence of that call in the first place, whether that means diverting it to a social communication structure, so your 988 line, your 211, your Connecticut United Way, your community resources. The IPIDC, oh, actually I'll go through this because this is relevant. 1 in 4, nationally speaking, 1 in 4 Americans has a disability or multiple. And these are estimates, so it's likely the case that the number is higher. In Connecticut, it's roughly 1 in 5. Again, these are estimates, emphasis on estimates, so the figure is likely higher. Persons with disabilities who die during encounters with police are those who have disabilities. And these data express that individuals with severe mental illness can constitute 1 in 4 fatal encounters with police, and then your 1 in 10 calls, 1 in 10 crisis calls placed to police. So that's the disability or civilian population side. But then you also have the law enforcement police side. Police themselves may be members of the disability community. And so this is where the communities intersect. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicide rates are at 5 times higher than that of the civilian population. So these are two relevant figures for why are we here in the first place talking about this, because this is the nexus, the connective tissue between your police community and the disability community. And again, police and firefighters are more likely to die by suicide than in line of duty. So it could be the case that you have police and first responders who in fact have disabilities because of the profession. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the IPIDC, alphabet soup for the Improving Police Interactions with the Disability Community subcommittee, has identified 4 areas or themes in which to make recommendations for concrete, tangible action. So not just concepts, those are important, but then how do you implement those concepts? So the talk and then the action. Throughout and across these 4 areas, that core goal that has been set from the beginning is identifying substantive, tangible mechanisms for improving interactions between the police community and the disability community. Again, noting that there might be some overlap between the two. Put another way, the idea is to build trust, conditions of trust between police and the disability community. So the order I discuss these areas of recommendations in no way suggests that one genre is more important than the other or more valuable than the other. They are all interrelated and connected. So one area that has been identified is the role of social workers in responding to crisis calls placed by those persons in Connecticut with disabilities. Whether disability is a factor in the call or not does not matter. The role of social workers is being looked at regardless. The idea here is that social workers could potentially de-escalate a tense situation by providing a tailored response specific to that person in crisis, specific to their disability. And we've looked at different models that can take place. Whether it's social workers as a co-responder, so they actually respond on scene with the officer, your co-responder. Another model calls for social workers to operate as a second responder. The police, law enforcement clear the scene of any danger, and then the social worker comes in once that danger has been cleared. Or they can function as first responders as part of a crisis intervention team, or CIT, again another acronym. In some jurisdictions across the nation, they're called critical incident teams, but they're more or less the same. It's this idea of the social worker working in conjunction with a police officer to respond to that person in crisis. Another site that we've identified for further study and possible implementation is voluntary registry system. This is a tangible tool, so it's a concept but also a tool, by which individuals with disabilities or their guardians, family members, can choose to register, so emphasis on voluntary. So you volunteer your information, which actually goes back to the trust building component, right? You trust your police, you share that information. There's no trust there, this is not going to happen. So it's predicated on that condition of trust. They register their relevant disability information, address, possibly a photo with their local PD and social services system, because it could be the case that the jurisdiction has a social worker structure. So the idea here is that if residents equip their police with information, police will be better equipped to respond to that crisis call. So again, it's the one community and then the other, and then they intersect for improvement. A third area is police education and training. So Connecticut does have the national 40-hour minimum of crisis intervention team training, but the idea would be to add to that. So possibly you have the 4 hours of training on autism, on responding to persons with autism, but maybe you increase the frequency of that. Instead of annually, maybe it's biannually, or instead of every 3 years, it's once a year. So different states have been piloting different frequency intervals as to what best equips their law enforcement personnel on the ground. And then finally, the role of school resource officers in responding to students, to youth who may be experiencing a crisis during the school day. And the idea here is that SROs, school resource officers, can be a potential vital part of a response team. So going back to that team structure, the CIT, except now you place that in a school setting, and again, using that as a response to students in crisis who have disabilities. And so that's what we've been looking at, and as Andrew stated, we are absolutely open to feedback. This is part and parcel to building trust between community and between police and connecting the two. So thank you for your time, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. We'll now go to the moderated portion of the event, and we are lucky to have Stan Simpson with us tonight to do that. And before I introduce Stan, I do want to thank the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, without which their support we wouldn't be able to hold these dialogues here tonight. And they also supported a lot of the work of the task force. Stan is a principal and resident of Stan Simpson Enterprises LLC, a strategic communications firm, and he has worked, as I'm sure many of you know, within the media business for 30 years and is a multiple award-winning journalist. Mr. Simpson is among a small number in the media business who have served as a newspaper columnist at the Hartford Courant, a radio talk show host with CBS in 1080, and a television talk show host with Fox 61's Real People with Stan Simpson. And he also served as the founding director of the Hartford Journalism and Media Academy, a startup public high school in Hartford's North End. We're so grateful to have Mr. Simpson here tonight. Mr. Simpson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Back in the front. I'm going to be the moderator for what we think will be a very engaging conversation with a very distinguished panel about two very important topics. As you heard, the diversifying of police force, and also how do you deal more constructively with folks who are in the disability community. So really two fascinating topics. We're going to keep it freewheeling, have great conversation, have the audience join us. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. Here's the format, very simple format. I'm going to ask questions of the panel. They're going to ask. I'm going to encourage panel members, don't feel that if I only ask you the question, no one else can respond. If someone else wants to respond, just raise your hand. We have one microphone. We'll make it work. But don't feel if you want to chime in, chime in. So we'll keep it freewheeling and moving. And again, we'll have Q&A at some point during the conversation. So without further ado, we had Dr. Anee Kringen, who you heard from before. Andrew read her bio. I think what's interesting about her background, she's a former police officer in Virginia. So I think that's really, to me, fascinating, going from a police officer to now a national expert on research in diversifying force. I'm going to probe a bit. We're going to find out. I'm going to bet that something happened in Virginia that turned her life around and compelled her to be on the other side of this. So fascinating background. We also heard from Dr. Meghan Peterson, and Meghan's forte is public law, public theory, and publishing, and public law, and public policing, public law, public theory, and policing. Sorry, Meghan. Then Daryl McGraw. Daryl is chairman of the Connecticut Public Transparency and Accountability Task Force. He's a community organizer. He's a community activist. He's a public speaker. He recently became a TEDx sensation online. He gave one of those TEDx talks at the Bushel, I think it was, and he became sort of this TEDx sensation. So he's adding to his resume a former program director for Yale's Department of Psychiatry. And then we have Jonathan Slifka. Jonathan is the executive assistant to the commissioner, Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services. He's the governor's liaison to the disability community, and his mission is to increase outreach and services to those in the disability community. He's a champion for those who struggle with disabilities. Thank you for your service, Jonathan. And thank you for your service, Chief Jack Drumm. He is the police chief of Madison, 34 years in law enforcement, 25 years with the Connecticut State Police, highly decorated officer, earned commendations for bravery, outstanding police work, and exceptional service. Chief, thank you for your service. So we're going to get things rolling. Chief, when you hear Dr. Ann say, listen, Black, Latino, and women officers are far less likely to use force, what does that tell you, and what can you do about that?
Today in policing, it's very, very difficult to find candidates and people that want to apply to the position. We're Madison. I retired formally from the Connecticut State Police, a much larger agency. We're able to have a recruiting division within. By the way, a Hartford officer joins us, and she is one of the recruiting officers for Hartford, and she was telling me she's going to be in New York tomorrow recruiting. So I was pretty impressed with that. I got to tell you, that was an aha moment. In a smaller department, we rely on regional police committees that we have, that we will go out and research and visit college campuses. We go to different neighborhoods with different cities, trying to get people to be enlisted and have an interest in policing. A lot of it also starts from the college campuses. We'll bring in interns that have this interest in policing. I think that what's happened in America across the landscape today, particularly in the last 3 years, you know, some people maybe that were interested in policing, maybe they were holding off a little bit. Policing in general, listen, the majority of people, men and women, people from all walks of life that serve as police officers in this country, they're a very dedicated group of people. And most certainly in the state of Connecticut, we have one of the most challenging police academies in the country. You know, what we require for certification exceeds what many other states have. That being said, we try to attract the best candidates. I think today we're looking at it, well, certainly I am a little bit differently. I had an encounter recently on how I was looking for a police officer, you know, and I have these moments that happen, like tonight. I'm in Bridgeport, I'm in federal court, and there's a gentleman working as a security officer, and I'm waiting for, it's like 10 of 8. So I'm watching this person, people are coming in and they're asking him questions. Like there's people in line. This is a kid who's a security officer, grew up in Bridgeport. So I'm watching, then it's my turn, and I have to ask the question. I said, so how long have you been in security? He said, about 3 years. I'm waiting to be a policeman in Bridgeport. He's on a list. And I'm looking at this young, I call him lad, and I'm saying to myself, gosh, this kid has like incredible skills, people skills that I just watched. That I couldn't have gotten out of any interview other than my own encounter with him. So I started talking a little further. I said, well, where are you in the list of Bridgeport? He said, well, they're telling me I'm like maybe 2 years out, like I'm 800 and something. So I asked him his background. He told me his background. He grew up in Bridgeport, where he grew up in one of the projects, and how he'd like to go to school. So I didn't leave there without giving him my card and my email. And where I'm going with this, what I'm telling you is that we try to find people in some unusual circumstances. I don't have a recruiting division. I have to rely on what I do with the group, the South Central region. We do exams, but the exam doesn't really attract enough candidates for us presently. You have to remember that years ago, South Central used to get 180 to 1,800 applicants within a quarter period. I believe the last quarter produced 18 applicants. So for us, we have to look at various ways to recruit, various ways to bring people to the table to at least observe, come into our organization, see what they like, dislike, what they didn't know, educate them. So that's how we're going about it right now for a smaller agency. But again, hats off to Hartford PD for getting on the road and trying to attract candidates to that department.
Thank you, Chief. Daryl, same question. I'm not sure if the Chief answered that question. I want to answer it more directly. What does it tell you when the studies show that Black, Latino, and women officers are less likely to use force on the job? What does that tell you from your own personal perspective?
Testing. I appreciate it. And Chief Drumm, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service on the task force. I thank you for being here tonight and just being a really great colleague. From the question that Stan answered, I think that it goes back to what many have said, where we talk about coming from those environments, seeing working with multiple people across the state, whether it be law enforcement, prosecutors, public defenders, they all say that when they see someone that looks like them, it's like seeing their son or their relative or seeing themselves. I think the same thing is with law enforcement. When they're interacting with black and brown people in black communities, they could see either themselves or where they've come from, and they can relate. So therefore, that use of force, I don't want to say it's fear-based, but that use of force is less likely because they actually see themselves in the individuals that they're interacting with. So I could see how the data could reflect that.
So, Dr. Ann or Meghan and or John, what can be done with that? Now, you have this data, the whole issue is diversifying forces, why it's important. If there are less interactions or less violent interactions, and there's less incidents, less people dying, getting hurt. So how do you take this data and turn it into a compelling clarion call for other police chiefs that, hey, diversity is more than just a feel-good thing. It impacts your police department in a very good way. How do you leverage that data to get leaders to take action?
Yeah, no, that's the $1 million question, and one that I think the chief already sort of mentioned. We want to do it, we don't necessarily know how, or we see barriers to doing it, right? And so one of the things that I really like about the recommendations that we set forth is really saying, hey, as a state, we're pushing out those promising practices so that we're not kind of telling all departments, hey, figure it out for yourself, right? And what I find really fascinating is that I believe it was out of a 2016 recommendation. It was a 2015 recommendation to a general statute, right, saying diversify, right? And then we said 6 years later, hey, where are we on this, right? And so part of it is holding departments accountable by saying, hey, what is your plan? Do you have a plan in place to do so? But we're also giving you the tools. And then I think the other aspect is really also helping departments understand what are the potential barriers that they may not have identified through sort of their own personal anecdotal experience, right? So for example, I worked with the police department in Texas, and I remember they wanted so badly, they're like, Ann, we want to hire more female officers. And then they told me, but, once you get to the police academy, you cut your hair 1.5 inches long. And I'm like, oh, just 1.5 inches off the bottom? And they were like, no, all women have to have their hair 1.5 inches. And I said, but you want to diversify? And they were like, yes, but we've always had this rule in place. It means you can do 5-minute showers. And they just didn't really understand that, hey, this is a barrier to actually increasing, right? And it wasn't until I conducted interviews where women just said, hey, I'm going to go to another police department, right? I don't have to go here. And so I think part of it is what are the barriers to the specific groups that we are trying to recruit and hire, but also maybe even more generally, since we're having these recommendations go to post, what are sort of the bigger barriers related to the state of Connecticut, right? And so if we're going to New York to go to find people, how do we actually attract people from other states to do policing here, which I think is a really compelling argument.
You want to add something? You good? Well, okay, Jonathan, I want to talk about the issue of empathy. When we talk about these stats and diversifying departments, it really talks about leadership and empathy. I want you to talk a bit about empathy and why it's so important with community policing, whether it's gender, race, folks with disability. It really comes down to leadership and empathy. Can you talk about that?
So I think empathy boils down to remembering that as a police officer, you start as a person, and oftentimes you start as a person of that community. If you start from that foundational thought process and that foundational basis in your philosophical approach towards the people that you interact with as police officers, it goes a long way to humanizing those interactions. If you live in the same town as the people that you're interacting with as a police officer, if they see you in situations outside of the uniform, that goes a long way to building that empathy, building that trust that we've been talking about. And it can go a long way to really changing your philosophical approach towards the people that you're interacting with as a member of law enforcement. Is remembering that you're a citizen as well, and oftentimes you are a citizen of the community in which you're policing.
I want to segue back to Austin, Texas, that piece with 60 Minutes, Dr. Ann, Dr. Meghan. Austin is unique. It has a lot of women who are in power. You tell the audience real quick the stats on the leadership ranks and the overall demographics for women in Austin on the police part?
I'll try and get them right.
Just approximate. You can approximate.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have two of our assistant chiefs. Our chief of staff is a black female new chief of staff. She's fantastic, Robin Henderson. And then my former commander, who's actually in 60 Minutes with me, working on the training academy, she was just promoted to assistant chief. But in terms of commander ranks, I believe we have only one female commander as it stands right now.
And how are they with the rank and file?
I'm sorry?
What kind of numbers are there with the rank and file?
Within rank and file, I want to say we're maybe at 10%,
okay.
So lower than average, and it's something that we're really aware of. And it's interesting because I actually had someone just send me a text message saying, how are we in comparison to other Texas police departments? On average, normally, larger departments have more women, right, across the nation. So here in Connecticut it holds true, but also nationally. So it is pretty interesting that I think as a 11th biggest city in the nation, that we're still at 10%,
okay.
And that we're trying to sort of unpack and dismantle what are some of the reasons as to why that happens.
Because the point I was trying to make here is that isn't it simple of having leaderships of color, leaderships who are women, leadership that reflects what you want for the rank and file. In other words, when I was a columnist, folks would call all the time saying, hey, we're trying to have a diverse event for our community. We're really struggling. Can you help us make our event more diverse? I said, well, how many folks do you have on your planning committee who are of color? Huh? We'll start from there, right? This is why you have a problem. You have a homogenous leadership rank, and you're trying to get more diverse, and you know where to go, and you have no one of color or anyone of gender to reflect that. So that's the point I'm trying to make, that where you see police departments and leadership of color, there tends to be an osmosis thing where it happens by itself. When you have women in power, they tend to see more talented women. When you have people of color in power, they tend to see more talented people of color. Would you agree with that? Is that too simplistic?
No, I don't think that's too simplistic. And then it's partly how do you get there, right? And that certain departments, it's just taken so long. So for example, one of the individuals who actually brought me in an Austin Police Department, she is the first female Asian commander. And she was
Asian what? I'm sorry.
Asian commander. And so commander rank is right below assistant chief rank, and so there may be 35 or so commanders in the department, and then you move up to assistant chief where there may be 6 or 7. And so it's pretty high ranking, and she's the first female Asian, and Asian population within Austin is the fastest growing. And we're at about 9%. And I say we because I identify as being Asian. So we're at about 9%, and she's one of the first. And so I think part of this is how do you think about, and I know that she now does all of these events related to the Asian communities. And when we recently did a Community Connect program where we had cadets go out into the communities and had community members come in, the Asian community said we always invite PD to our events, and they haven't been coming, right? And that it was like being able to hear that and then say, hey, there are enough people in the room to remind the chiefs, to say, hey, you need to be going to these events. This community has noticed that you haven't noticed, their problems and what's going on with their communities. And so that's I think the biggest part is they see, but they also have access to individuals who, as we've already discussed, look like them, right? And are able to understand backgrounds to be able to filter that message to, where it needs to go.
Thank you. Chief, they say that 80% of police calls, 80% really require a social worker more than a uniformed officer. I think this was in the 60 Minutes piece they did with Dr. Ann the other day. Did that surprise you? Because, the old adage for police officers is, hey, I'm not a social worker, but the stats say they may have to be.
The majority of our department is crisis intervention trained, and that's been worth its weight. Years ago, when we first encountered people that were in crisis, there was like one response. We bring them to a medical facility, and we're there for observation. Crisis intervention training, obviously, we'll meet somebody in crisis. We do have a couple of residencies within our town which require a lot of response. Now it's de-escalation. We sit there and we talk them down. We then have follow-up with our youth and family services and other organizations. To answer your question, if we do about 100 and maybe 50, 60 calls a year in my community for a psychotic episode of somebody in need, I would say probably 10, 15% require a police presence.
What percentage?
10 to 15% would require a police presence.
Jonathan, I'll get you to, what does that tell you, Jonathan? 10 to 15% require a police presence. For the most part, 80% of calls are for social workers. Your perspective on that?
I think it speaks to so many things. I think it speaks to the growing, exponentially growing mental health issues in this country.
I'm going to speak a little louder because I'm having a hard time.
I think it speaks to the exponentially growing mental health issues in this country, and from the help and assistance side, we need to play catch up on that. And it should not be law enforcement's responsibility to address those by themselves. There should be licensed, there should be professionals that have gone to school for that, that have trained in that can assist in those cases. And oftentimes, I mean, it just goes to show you the police don't need to oftentimes be there. You know, and I think that's why we looked at ways to de-escalate those calls, ways to divert those kind of calls, because there are other people in other professions that are just better equipped to handle those situations in the short term and in the long term.
Dr. Peterson, what can be done there with the diversity effort if it's a challenge to get the rank and file to diversify, but 80% of the calls are for social workers? Is there an opportunity there to diversify your social workers so at least they're interacting with the police, and perhaps that creates a better consciousness as far as dealing with people of color? If you have more social workers of color who work with police, that may help to ease things. Thoughts?
Absolutely. There is definitely a synergy and a nexus between law enforcement, so your classic police response, your police personnel, and then your social workers who can provide that mental health targeted response. These are people who have been trained. Likewise, law enforcement have also received this national minimum standard training, 40 hours. But it's the mental health professionals that have gone to school for years and have that tailored response. And it's not to say that, oh, it's just a police response or a social worker response. It's in fact that co-responder model that we see across the United States and here in Connecticut. I'm thinking specifically of New London, where New London has had a co-responder model. They have dispatched social workers, sometimes in place of or alongside law enforcement for the last 30 years. I'm thinking also of Eugene, Oregon, which has CAHOOTS, another alphabet soup name, Crisis Assistance Out on the Streets program, which again has been in place for over 3 decades. And these are actually volunteer personnel that respond to, in many cases, these are individuals in crisis who are repeat callers. So it's not the case that these individuals are just making a once a year call. These are repeat callers. And so law enforcement is aware. They're there if needed. But in Eugene, Oregon, they're actually dispatching social work volunteer personnel who are partnering with, it's called the White Bird Clinic. So it's your mental health community resource. So yes, there absolutely is an energy there regarding collaboration between law enforcement on the one hand and your social worker community on the other. Yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan, you had mentioned before the show that one of the challenges with dealing with the disability community for a police officer is that you have visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. And sometimes the invisible disabilities end up triggering bad acts. For example, a kid who may have autism, like my son does, who maybe won't look you in the eye, and so an officer may take that as disrespectful and therefore escalates the response. Can you talk more about the importance of training and the visible disability versus the invisible disability?
Sure. I think the long and short of it is that the disability community is a nuanced community, Stan.
Say it again, John.
The disability community is a nuanced community, okay? You have invisible disabilities and visible disabilities. You have disabilities that show as more severe and others that show less severe. And I think there needs to be more training, potentially at the post level, but also in-service training that continues to evolve as our education of certain disabilities evolves, so that we can recognize, so that the police can recognize certain signs, certain triggers. They can be aware of those things when they walk into a situation. And so they can walk in with a less armed mentality and a less excited mentality, however you want to.
That paramilitary mentality.
That's correct, right. And more of again, going back to your question of earlier, more of a disarming, more of a sympathetic mentality into a given situation. And the challenge with that is, again, especially with the invisible disabilities, they might be going into a situation, whatever it may be, and the person that they're going to directly interact with may have a disability, but they don't know it going in. And that is a constant challenge, and I think it's just continuous training, Stan, because the continuous training will lead to better and more conscious awareness on a regular basis, and will minimize some of the horrible results that we've read about recently and going back a ways, especially, as you pointed out, especially in situations such as with the autism community.
Thank you. Daryl McGraw, I'm going to put an HR hat on you, human resources. You're going to be in charge of reimagining police departments. You've been out there, you know the streets, you know the communities, you know the interactions, you know the pros, the cons, the data. How would you sell a career in policing to a young urban child, or black Latino child, or Asian, a kid of color? How would you sell that to them?
Oh, I like the HR hat. I got a promotion real quick. I appreciate that. No, I think that if we want to see change in a community, we want to see that change. You want to see that if you don't like what's happening, right? When I was taught that if you don't like what's happening, we can't. This is not a spectator sport, right? Get involved, get involved, and be that change. My son, who's 18, would like to be a police officer, and this is a conversation him and I have had for a little while now. And he's 6'10", so I just worry about a police car fitting him, like that he can fit into a police car more so than anything else, right? But this is his thing. He wants to be involved in law enforcement because he knows that there is, some changes and I believe that he believes he can bring that change. So inviting those young people to be the change that they want to see in their community, right? Being those leaders and being those, like when I was growing up, there was an officer named Steve, and I don't even know if Steve had a police car, but everybody in the community knew him. And he just was like, he crossed the crossing guard, he did all these different things. And having that relationship with Steve made people want to be police officers. We don't see that example anymore in our communities. What we see is a lot of times we see that run and gun, come in, you're taking my dad away, you're arresting my brother, you're doing this, or what we see on the media, but we don't get to see those interactions, those community interactions, so we need to bring that back in and actually invite young people to be that change in the community. So I appreciate that question.
Chief, have you had to change your approach to recruiting? You've been around for 42 years, 50 years? What was it, 60?
How long have you been around?
But have you had to change your approach to how you pitch a career in policing to new recruits?
Absolutely. What worked then does not work now. Everybody here touched on it. One, as a recruit, you used to recruit within your own environment, or what's organic to your community, what's organic to, depending if you're urban, if you're out in the sticks somewhere, it goes beyond that. We talked about that earlier. You know, you have to reach out to the schools. You have to have a mentorship program. The SROs are an incredible tool.
SROs are the
school resource officers. The community service officers, tremendous asset for policing, at least to get people to understand who we are, what we do, why we do what we do, and some, we'll get the questions, we'll get people interested. Most of my folks that have come into my police department, which is a suburban agency, have come from cities. You know, they wanted to be police officers, they had some sort of mentorship, whether it be Hartford, New Haven, or Bridgeport, which got them interested in the program, got them interested in policing. But I'd like to think that everybody still comes to being a cop because they want to do public service. They want that noble profession. I still like to believe that. And I think that that still does exist. I talked about that kid that was a security guard in that building. It was obvious to me that this kid was there. He'd been doing other things. He was there working, just got off the midnight shift. He was greeting people like he just got up. And I said, that's a quality. I just watched him and studied him. I like to find a lot of officers like that as potential candidates. There's all walks of life today also. You know, I have 2 folks entering the academy identify as gay males.
Say it again?
Identify as gay males.
Gay males.
Gay males. So we have to look beyond what was traditions of law enforcement. We're no longer that warrior mentality. Now we serve as guardians, more than less. We have that ability when needed, obviously in crisis. John, I just wanted, if I may, speak to, I took over an agency that was in trouble.
Madison.
The Madison Police Department. I took that over in 2010. We're dual accredited now. We've been advanced for over 9 years now. What we did though, and it's kind of fun when it comes out of a storm. 2 hurricanes we had, that was Sandy, then what was the other one? Irene, is that we had people in crisis. We learned quickly who was on a machine, who had disabilities, who needed life-saving scripts. And our cops, the great people that I worked with, went out into the community and they took care of those needs. Not really traditional policing, but from that point on, that was like the magic B12 bullet for me when I had to take over a police department that was in crisis, and immediately that sort of people, that integrity, trust, congruency was returning. That it was a change of culture for the positive.
Did you change culture or did you change people? Because sometimes it's hard to change culture without doing a full-scale cleaning out of your ranks.
I think if we check history and look at the articles, I had to remove people.
Okay, a lot?
And I had to select, went out, for a small agency, more than half.
All right, so that's part of the, I mean, just to be real here, if you're going to make change, whether it's a police department or a sports team or a business that's failing, most likely changing culture entails getting rid of people.
It takes a lot of courage. And, you know, people say, oh, that person's a leader. And, well, leadership's a behavior. It's not a person. It's one not practiced by many. Nobody wants to walk down that path where, you know, if you practice that leadership, you'll piss people off. You may get fired because some of the agency doesn't care for that. But the bottom line is you have to have the courage to do the right thing. In the case of this agency, we had to go in. We had to remove people that had been there for years that just weren't following it. They just weren't signing on. And we had to change the culture, bring in folks from all walks of life throughout this state and beyond. And I'm very proud to say that, listen, every agency still has problems. Nothing's 100%. But the fact that we maintain our accreditation, maintain the trust with people, and I have over 800 people registered in my CAD database with special needs. So we know those who live within our community that we have a call for their house. And one of the things is we still held on to the R1, oxygen and defib. We respond with the ambulances.
Okay, what's the argument, that police terminology on this, Doug?
Well, that's a designation for first responder for medical emergency. Okay. And the reason we do that is because that's part of that public safety. That's part of that connection with the community I never, ever want to give up. And also, we're there within 4 minutes, most places in town. So when you need a defib or an oxygen, you want it there yesterday.
Right. Okay. Michelle, our Zoom Meister, anything on Zoom? I'm going to open up the conversation now to the public. So feel free, if you have a question, raise your hand. You see we have a little microphone deficit. Oh, we have a microphone here. We have a roving mic here. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll see you. We'll get to you, and we'll go from there. We'll keep it rolling. So don't be shy. Raise your hand. Michelle, let's give me a little holler if you have. Is that a sign? Yeah. Okay, we do have a question.
Hello. So Anna Mitchell is asking, has there been any discussion on how they will handle disabled individuals that call for help and speak a different language?
Michelle, I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Anna Mitchell is asking if there has been any discussion on how they will handle disabled individuals that call for help and speak a different language.
Oh, good question. Good question. Chief, while you marinate, Chief, I'm going to have Jonathan. How big a problem could that be with disabled people who have an emergency call and don't speak the language? That further compounds the problem, I'm assuming. But talk about that, please.
So I think was the question related to emergency situations or just?
It was during Dr. Meghan's presentation.
So we had, it's certainly an area for further study. We didn't get to examine that too deeply or too specifically. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, we did get to hear about calls that came in for those who are deaf and hard of hearing that communicate via text. So that was one specific that has been done in the state of Connecticut is the text to 911 option, for example. It was introduced, I think, just over a year ago. And so while that is for anyone who's in a crisis situation, certainly I think that was the initial intent of it, that is something that can be utilized by the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I'm not sure I don't know if it's available in different languages. I'm not sure if we got that information. But certainly for the deaf and hard of hearing community, that was addressed for the purposes of the research that we did. In terms of other languages, it's certainly something that we would need to look into further, as it wasn't something that came up as a priority from any of the members of our subcommittee specifically, but certainly something that we can consider for further study.
Dr. Peterson, does this make the case for the registry that you talked about, the folks who are with disabilities registering? Does that tie into that, where if you have someone who responds, who needs a call, doesn't speak English, a different language, if there's a card or a registry where they know, okay, I've got a bilingual or Irish speaking, whatever, doesn't that help the police interaction? Is that what you're talking about when you say the registry and why it's so important?
Right, absolutely. So as a tool and not just a concept, right? So we can talk about the idea of a voluntary registry system, and it is exactly that. It is a system of relevant information, whether that includes whether that individual with disability speaks a different language, is deaf, hard of hearing, needs an assistive device. So all of that information would be put into that system. And that would facilitate response for the responding social worker, if that town has a social worker response structure, and law enforcement. So it's a twofold mechanism or tool, if you will. Yes, so that absolutely would include that data, that information.
Okay. Jonathan, would a registry, your thoughts on that? Is that too intrusive from your standpoint? Or is something, how do you feel about it, not having to, but having the option to register if you have disability?
I think at the heart of it, what we said is it would be something that would be voluntary. I certainly, and it's a challenging thing to convince all members of the disability community to consider. I completely get that, and I respect that. Because there's a stigma that's attached to it, and there's other things to consider, like who maintains that data, how confidential is it, how well kept is it in terms of security, things of that nature. So it's not just distributed to anyone that asks for it. If you were to ask me personally, my personal belief would be that if I could give the police any additional information on me that would give them all the information they need to handle a situation in which I might be involved, I personally think that is a good thing. That being said, there are numerous situations where you would be potentially, as a policeman, you might potentially be interacting with somebody with a disability, but it's not related to their disability, right? If I get pulled over, I shared this joke with Chief Drumm and others. If I get pulled over, it's not because I have spina bifida, it's because I have a lead arm. I'm speeding, I'm going too fast. So while you are interacting with someone with a disability, in that situation, you're not interacting with them because of that disability. And that separation that is one of the things that makes convincing members of the disability community to participate in a registry very, very challenging. And I get it. I absolutely get it.
Chime in?
Yeah, I think, and then there's also this aspect of figuring out the balance with community, right? Because I think, like in Austin, a lot of communities would say, I don't want to give the police my information about me at all, right? Like, I don't want anything personal about me, right? And so it's, how do you figure out the way to close the gap, right? So what do we do on the training side, and how do we give officers the tools to be able to say, you may not be able to recognize what the disability is, but on average, these are good strategies that would allow you to have more time to assess, right? Or to figure out, is this person safe, right? And if they're safe and you're safe, what can we do in the meantime? And then run through the sort of list. Could it be a language, differential? Could it be, something that's going on? Could it be crisis? So that we're not saying, hey, the database is the only solution, but that in conjunction with training or other tools would allow for sort of a more robust way to serve the community. So I think it's a really good start to say, hey, if we can give police more information so that they can know how to handle these situations in any way, whether it's through training, whether it's through a database, but also making sure that communities that don't feel comfortable also have the resources to feel safe in their communities as well.
Dr. Peterson, Dr. Kringen, I want to stay with you guys there. What promising practices, right? One of the things you mentioned here on the bullet point. What's happening in Connecticut? Is there a promising practice in Connecticut or even nationwide outside of Austin where you say, wow, that's a really innovative idea? Anything that gives you encouragement?
I do. I mean, throughout the U.S., we are seeing social worker pilot programs in conjunction with law enforcement, specifically to improve response to individuals who have disabilities who are placing crisis calls. I'm thinking specifically, I think it's in Maryland, that actually has recruited families and persons with disabilities to participate in training programs for police. So in effect, you get police in the same room with families of persons of disabilities, and then you also have social workers who are participating in the training. So you're connecting all of those different communities, and we are seeing examples, concrete examples of trainings. And I always think about these things that are interrelated. They are connected. There's all these tools that are part of the toolbox. So you have the voluntary registry system, that's one component. Expanded training and education, that's one component. And I dare say maybe you do not have one without the other, because you do not want to implement a tool that law enforcement or social workers who are responding with law enforcement do not know how to use. So it's a combination of all these things, and we do see these practices being put into place, whether it is in Eugene, Oregon, whether it is in Washington State, whether it is in Massachusetts, where they actually do have a registry system, so just our neighboring state, and Connecticut. Again, we see different towns and cities looking at these tools and implementing them and seeing how it goes. It is very experimental, yeah.
Dr. Kringen?
Yeah, I think the main theme is sort of connection, right? And I don't know if we're all just really starved for connection due to COVID. And so we want to talk about our ideas and we want to share them. But I do think that the solution to a lot of these problems is, how do you have the right people in the right places, right? And so whether it's social workers, working with police on different issues, is it talking about, one of the recommendations from disability subcommittee is related to wellness, right? And I think that officer wellness historically isn't something we've discussed. We've discussed more so in the last 4 years. But it is something of saying, you know, there is a story behind officer lives that is really important to understanding what do they experience when they go to calls for service, and what is it like, you know, in Austin we're dealing with staffing crises, right? What is it like if they run from call to call to call that are all, you know, priority one, right? And what is sort of their, you know, constitution at the end of that shift, right? And I think just sort of that awareness that that is something that perhaps can potentially be problematic across all of these things is how are these issues connected to problems that we either know are problems or problems that haven't yet had the solutions in place, and then how do we look at agencies that have maybe had a more robust wellness program or had more robust partnerships with social workers to see, is it something that we within our agency have the capacity to model?
How about the Camden story, Camden Police's story? Some people have heard about. They reimagined the department, changed from that warrior mentality to more of a social work interaction, you know, model. Has that model gotten any traction at all, or is it considered sort of a one-off?
I would say it's kind of challenging in that I actually don't, I know the story of Camden Police Department, but it's sort of like the myth, the legend, right? But I don't know enough of the details to know, have other departments specifically done a replication? Because the other challenge that I will say that we haven't solved within policing is really the lack of evaluation research, right? And so we talk about a lot of departments doing a lot of really interesting things, but I always, you know, at least with my home department, say if we don't write about it and we don't think of a robust evaluation and actually be able to demonstrate that it works, command will change and we'll all forget about this. Right. And so part of the things, you know, there's been some promising evidence related to the ICAT de-escalation training, and that we've been working towards more, you know, robust evaluations of these types of things. But even, you know, what goes on in Austin, because we've changed so many different things at the same time, we can't really say it's this one thing that we did, right? And so one of the things that I think we have to move towards is, as we work on these models, how do we work with our university partners to really be able to evaluate, to be able to say these are the things that that have perhaps worked.
Okay.
So
I want to remind all to join the conversation. Any questions, raise your hand. We have a roving microphone. Our Zoom folks, if you have a question, put it in the chat. Michelle will get it off to me. So, Chief, I don't want to ignore you on that Hamden. I'm going to assume you're familiar with the Camden, New Jersey story. Your thoughts, again, how they reimagined the whole, for those of you who don't know, Camden, they basically blew up the police department, new chief, they changed the whole mentality and structure, going away from guns and bats to more de-escalating type of mentality where they're more engaged with their community, therefore less likely to get involved in violent interactions.
Well, first off, they were able to change, they accepted the change. They knew they had to do it.
Who's they? We say they. Who's
The
they?
community. The community accepted the change. They knew they had to change the culture of the prevailing agency at that time. And we talked
and I'm sorry, Chief, Camden was mostly, but like Hartford, it's like a mostly black urban city in Jersey, right? The
Yes,
demographics were mostly
yes, it
black.
is. And they had gone through a few leadership within a short period of time. As I talked to earlier, that's not an easy task. You know, so you have to get people to, and the key to Camden, at least from what I gathered when I've read, and is that, you know, they were able to get the community to back them. They were able to get the community to partner with them. They had the various agencies, their youth and family resources, their schools. They were able to get the partnership, which helped them start and move the way to get to the success they have today. That was key. They had to, and those that, you know, they had a lot of attrition at that period of time also, that people that moved on, you know, that were preventing it. It's very key that you have to do that.
So there are the community components so critical here. Community can't really back you unless they believe in you and they feel that you're genuine. So how does that happen? You gotta, it's easy to say community engagement, right? But they don't trust you. It's not gonna happen.
Well, listen, I wouldn't.
Well, I'm sorry, so you want to go to Daryl and get Daryl involved?
No, I appreciate that that question. I mean, and the other thing is, I would be remiss not to mention the importance of having people with lived experience like myself a part of those conversations from the beginning. We're talking about social workers, we're talking about training, but we're not talking about actual having people with lived experience who have interacted with law enforcement, whether it be negatively or positively, in these conversations. Part of these, when we're talking about hiring community members, we should be talking about adding individuals who have transitioned successfully out of the criminal justice system, who could be part of the conversations that could be saying, well, this is what worked, or this is what happened to me, was my experience. What we happen, we continuously cutting individuals who, we always say the people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but yet furthest and furthest away from the resources. So we need to be considering those individuals not as an afterthought, but as part of the process. And that goes to your question, Stan, about community. Are we asking the community what they need and what they want to see? One of the things that I remember, if my memory serves me correct, about the Camden chief, he fired everybody. Basically, everybody had to reapply for their position. The other thing that stood out to me was, it was this small thing which I thought was huge, and it goes back to my story about Steve being the community police officer in my community, was that he said, when you have to use the bathroom, don't come back here. You find the bathroom in the community. You connect with those community businesses and those organizations. And that way, those officers got to know community, and they interacted with community. So that was a different form of policing, similar to what the chief said. There had to be buy-in, and some people had to say, well, we don't want to do that. That's not what we want to do. But, and just last I'll say is that I think that both doctors said it very well, but the one piece that we're missing is trust. There's a lack of trust in Black and brown communities. They don't trust the police. They don't trust the police that police their communities right now. And that's an issue that we need to rebuild. So the campaign not only is hiring, but how do we rebuild trust back into these communities where we could start to trust the police officers? So maybe at some point down the road, I would give you my information and tell you where, the disabled people are. And last but not least, I'll say, is that when community is like in my community, in my neighborhood, I know my neighbor. I know, so if this person has a disability and you come in, I'm going to be able to say, hey, that's my neighbor, that's Joe, he has such and such, and I could speak to that because I'm there with him. But if we don't have that trust, then I'm not, the community's less than likely to engage with you.
What about this concept here? We heard of community service for folks who get arrested and punished. What about community service for police officers, for rookies coming out of the training camp? I don't know if they have this or not, but you have community service where you have to stay a year or whatever time you prescribe in the community. So you get to know, you have to volunteer somewhere, you have to get involved, know the restaurant owner, and have that where that's embedded for a year, and then they can begin, then you escalate, they become a full-blown officer after that. But sort of embed them in communities where they aren't maybe comfortable and let them learn the community, learn the people, and then say, okay, now you're going to go out and protect them. Chief?
I think anyone that takes over an agency in an urban environment, and I have worked somewhat in my career with urban environments, you have to go out and you have to meet people. You have to go to meetings that, coming in as a white officer, going into a Black community, you're going to find yourself in meetings that maybe you never thought you'd be. I guess in essence, the chief's got to hit the ground running. He or she's going to have to essentially dive right into the community, get to know the people, have a conversation with folks that, I had said this once earlier, listen, we tell people this is what we do, why we do it, and why we have to do it. And I think that sometimes some people have good encounters with police and some have not so good encounters with the police. But I think that even if you're not a fan of policing or of an officer or suspicious or lack of trust, that if you were to sit there and have a conversation with that officer, I would think you would come out with a clear understanding as to why we do what we do and what our commitment is. And I think that that's part of the process to moving where we need to go. Countless cups of coffee with people, that seems to work.
Now, this was something that we discussed in the task force meetings, and there was some pushback because the difficulty to hire or what have you. And there was multiple conversations in reference to that. For me, I think it would be gold. It would be a gold standard to have someone work in a community, especially someone who's not familiar with the community, to work in a community, to go to play kickball. You know, I'm interested in playing dodgeball with law enforcement at some point in time. You know, and working out, and having those interactions that are non-confrontational. I think getting to know where the local bodega and having that sandwich and having it, and we've seen it work in other places, and there are officers that are embedded in the community that do that every single day, and everybody knows them, but they're few and far between. And what I've seen in my own community, where I come from, New London, which was talked about, a lot of our law enforcement currently come from different cities and towns. So the interaction is usually only transactional, meaning that when they come in to do a job, and when they leave, that's what they're there for. That's problematic because you don't know the players. And when it becomes down to black and brown, then the only thing that you know is that person is black or brown. And their experiences, when I'm here to do transactional work, usually the people that I'm doing it with happen to be black and brown. So we all fit that description. And I'm speaking from lived experience, not something that I read. So I think that it's more important because if people spent that time in our community, they would know that the work that I do in the street and many others that look like me, that are dedicated to changing our communities, that are dedicated to making change in our communities. And just because we're black and brown, that doesn't mean that we fit the description.
So I'm reminded of something I learned from my brother. My brother was a mayor of this town for a very long time, and one of his main philosophies in terms of how he governed and operated, and it was taught to him, was to remember that first and foremost, he is a member of this community. And so if you're going to pass a law, make sure it's something you can live with. And I think I think that can translate to the philosophical approach and the mentality of the police is when you interact with the people that you interact with, whether you live in that town or not, your interactions with them are going to affect you. They're going to affect your reputation. They're going to affect the reputation of the police force that you work for. And so interact in a way that at the end of the day, you can go home and live with what you did.
Okay, we'll finish up quickly. 2 points, very quickly. Thumbs up, thumbs down for community policing, and then we'll get into your solutions. One place to start, first place to start, if we want to begin to seriously diversify police departments. So we'll finish up with community policing, and then we'll segue to the
community policing for police. Yes, community policing is a classic concept, and it is part and parcel to transparency and accountability. So again, these two terms that are part of the task force, but what do those two words look like in praxis, in real life? And it truly is about reciprocal trust. So trust on the part of the police community, trust on the part of the residents that they are there to help guard and defend and protect. And then in the case of the specific subcommittee, the improving police interactions with the disability community, improving trust on that part of that community. So going back to that classic core concept and practice.
community service. Community service.
Sure. So it's interesting because I wrote a paper maybe 5 years ago. New Haven Police Department at the time actually did volunteer hours during their academy. And we wrote about it, and it was interesting because maybe about 50 to 60% of the recruits in their police academy at the time were not New Haven residents. And I remember we did interviews with all of them during the academy and asked them questions like, had you ever been to New Haven before you decided to take this job? And you heard things like, no, I just heard guns blazing New Haven, right? Like they had never actually known anything about New Haven, and then they took the job, right? And so they were assigned to kind of district managers for the 10 districts in New Haven. They went to community meetings, and they did all of these various things in those particular districts. And that overall, their experiences were really positive and really understanding New Haven and being able to understand New Haven outside of this narrative that maybe perhaps that they had known. But perhaps what I thought was one of the more interesting, and granted, this was one study of one police department at one period of time, but that I did find really interesting is that I asked them the question, out of the 10 districts, did they want to go to the district where they already knew the individual assigned, where they already knew the area, if they could choose their assignment after graduating? To which almost all of them said, if they weren't in a high crime, like very fast paced district, no, I love my district, but I don't want to go there. I want to go where the action happens. And so they still were driven by this, right? And so I think the idea of doing things within training, right? We're doing a lot of the same things within New Haven related to community is really important. I think it's the first steps to really making sure that you're setting the cadets and then eventually the new officers up for success. But I think it does go back to what are you evaluating officers in and what activities, and then how are you actually incentivizing or rewarding the things that officers are doing, right? And so I think that it's a really great idea, but it's kind of one of many things that we need to think about if we really want to, improve the lives of officers, as well as make sure that we're able to follow through with what we promise to the community.
We have less than 10 minutes left. I want to do a lightning round with each of you to give me one quick bullet point, 15 seconds on where you start first. Before I do that, I promise the audience, we've got to find out what happened with Annie Virginia, why she left the DV. What happened there? What side were you on policing in brief, without 2 minutes?
The brief 2 minutes version, and then I'll give my 1 minute on what I would do on diversification, because you can read a bunch of stuff related to that, I actually had an internal conflict. I became very close with a couple of the kids in my beat who I helped study for their, it's not their GRE, it's the GED, right? Because they unfortunately weren't able to complete regular high school. And one of them I became really close with. He's super smart, and I knew about his girlfriend and what her name was, and I had a detective who called me out of Fairfax County and said, hey, we know these kids beat up another kid, and one of them's dating this girl, and it was my kid. And it was my kid. It was my kid that I just helped get through a GED. And so I gave him up, right? I was like, okay, I know the kid, I know it, go interview him. Arrest warrant came out, and I remember I called him and I said, I'm going to pick you up because I'd rather pick you up and transfer you over the line than have any other officer pick you up, right? And I remember I'm driving him, because you can't take someone to Fairfax County to jail, you have to transfer them over the line of jurisdiction. And he said to me, Officer Ann, are you disappointed? And I remember it was really hard to play both roles, right? Like, how do you do the law enforcement, which is what you've signed up to do, yet you still have this belief that, in many ways he was sort of set up for this failure, right? And that part of my job was every day watching that and then having to decide, what role do I want to play, right? So it was, for me, that was really it. And I know for a lot of officers, when I talk to them, they say that is the hardest part of their job, is figuring out how do they do what they need to do and also deal with the fact that they're working with humans, they're working with people. And I still keep in touch with him to this day. And anytime I do anything remotely successful, I always remind him, if it wasn't for this relationship, I wouldn't be where I am. And I often don't share that story because it feels very performative. So I appreciate the opportunity to share it here.
Accessibility, open door, listen.
Yeah, people with lived experience on a part of the hiring process.
Accessibility in terms of the hiring process to persons with disabilities, to diversify.
More dialogue and information sharing between the police communities, social worker communities, and disability communities.
Data, and also making sure that agencies have the resources to be able to diversify.
Yes, I want to thank Chief Riddick from West Hartford, who's joined us in the room too, and everybody that came. Thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to have conversations tomorrow night from 6 to 8 p.m. in Farmington Public Library, and then Wednesday night in Hartford Public Library, same time, 6 to 8 p.m., and that's both at the main branches. And you can find out more on our website, ctpolicetransparency.com. And Ann mentioned connection and everybody wanting to feel connected. A number of us have been meeting now and having these discussions virtually for the better part of 2 years. Ann I just met for the first time in person, came up from Texas to join us for these next 3 nights. She has the farthest travel, but Chief Drumm from Madison, he came up here to spend his time. As was noted earlier, some people could probably be shopping right about now, needing some presents and whatnot, but we felt the need to go out into the community and have these conversations because, as was discussed earlier, trust comes from conversations. It comes from knowing each other and hearing from each other. So we appreciate your coming out, and we thank you. And I handed out a survey. We'd love to hear from you. How could we do this better? What are the things that maybe you learned or some things that we can learn from you? So thank you so much. Appreciate it. Always appreciate CTN for covering these events and getting that information out to the general public. So thank you. And thanks, Stan.